Einen schönen guten Tag, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen. Sie nehmen jetzt wahrscheinlich mit einiger Verwunderung, stellen Sie fest, dass hier nicht unser lieber Kollege Gerhard Baumgartner sitzt, sondern meine Wenigkeit. Ich heiße Jana Starek und habe heute die Ehre, diese Sektion zu leiten, da Herr Baumgartner sich entschuldigen musste wegen eines wichtigen Termins, den er jetzt wahrnehmen muss. We are very pleased today to welcome our guests. First of all, we'll start with our colleague from Moscow, Mr. Daniil Aronson from the Institute of Philosophy of the Academy of Sciences. His main interest, as far as scientific topics are concerned, are political philosophy of ecology, and translations, historical translations, literary translations. We have here the possibility to hear from him later on, if anybody is interested, how it works to translate Hannah Arendt into Russian. Since we have a quite tight schedule, I asked all three colleagues possibly to have their statements no longer than 20 minutes. So we'll listen now to Daniil Aronson. The title of his contribution is Judge, and You Will Not Be Judged. From Judgment to Responsibility in Later Arendt's Thought. Daniil, may I ask you?
Yeah, thank you. So I got a technical problem with my laptop, so I think I'll have to improvise. But well, I hope that won't be a problem. So there is a well-known problem in Arendt's scholarship, problem posed and being recurrently posed, at least since Ronald Biner's analysis of Arendt's lectures on Kant's political philosophy. The problem whether Arendt's later concept of judgment can have any political relevance. For as you know, I think critics say that there are two different conceptions of judgment in Arendt's thought. The earlier one is based more on Aristotle and on Aristotle's idea of phronesis as practical wisdom, distinguished by Aristotle from philosopher's Sophia. Yes, and another source of Arendt's concept of judgment is Kant's theory of aesthetic judgment, Kant's reflective judgment of a disinterested spectator or Weltanschauer, as Kant puts it in German. Critics say that as long as in her later writings, such as Life of Mind and such as her lectures on Kant's political philosophy, Arendt bases her own concept of judgment almost exclusively on Kant. She even says that Kant discovered a completely new human faculty, judgment. So this means that actually she fails to make her theory of judgment politically relevant, because in Kant, judgmental process requires disinterestedness or outsideness of the judge, which means that whoever judges cannot be a a political actor, but rather a solitary thinker, withdrawn from any public and human affairs. So I think that actually in Arendt, judgment does her later conception of judgment, her Kantian conception, I think it does have political relevance, and this is because the judgmental process is actually what produces the experience of what Arendt calls collective responsibility. So, in short, the act of judgment leads or may lead to experience of political responsibility or collective responsibility. And whatever collective responsibility for Arendt is, it definitely should somehow be experienced. Why? Because Arendt's approach to politics is strictly phenomenological. So in politics, as she says, only that things matter which can become manifest or can appear. For example, Kant's idea of moral freedom is irrelevant to politics. Why? Because for Kant, moral freedom is something which is absent either in outer or in inner experience. Yeah? So for Arendt, that can be satisfactory as a political notion. Only that which appears can pertain to politics. Why does Arendt turn to the problem of judgment in the first place? I think this is connected with her long strive to find a way, as she put it, a way out of an impasse created by the breakdown of Western tradition. So in the absence of tradition, Arendt raised the problem of the new. Yes, she was concerned with the problem: how is the new anything new possible in human affairs? And during her intellectual career, roughly speaking, she proposed two solutions. Her earlier solution, for example, in the human condition, is that the realm of human action is this source of the new, and also human natality. Yeah, what she calls natality, the fact that with any generation, the new people come into being, so the newcomers. But at the same time, as Arendt saw action as a primary source of the new, she was concerned about the dangers of action itself, and these dangers that rise when action becomes alienated from the vita contemplativa. For example, Arendt was famously anxious about modern science, which, as she put it, actively interferes in nature, unleashing processes that never occur in nature itself, like nuclear reactions. Science which judges its theories by whether they work, which means whether they produce the predicted effect, which means science that judges its own theories not in terms of contemplations, but in terms of action. And here is also Arendt's related anxiety about modern ideologies, which for her not worldviews, not Weltanschauungen, but rather instruments for action. She was very much concerned about it because the scope and scale of human action in modern world became unprecedented, and this is in the time when contemplative sciences such as philosophy or social sciences, on the other hand, are exclusively preoccupied with the patterns, with the necessary, with what can be subsumed under laws. So the social sciences are preoccupied with, are blind to the phenomenon of action at the same time when the scope of action became unprecedented. Yes, and this is, for Arendt, this is a source of big dangers. And this is why I think that later in her search for the new, for the source of the new, Arendt turned away from action and natality to the to the faculty of judgment, which according to her belongs to vita contemplativa. How can judgment be politically relevant? This is because judgment in Arendt involves what she calls representative thinking. Yes, you remember, to think representatively for Arendt is to imagine oneself in the place of everyone else, but not everyone else in the world, but of everyone else in a world. Yes, a world, an artificial world created by human deeds and speech. Yes, and at the same time to realize that these others in the place of whom I imagine myself are different from me. So Arendt's conception of judgment is directly related to her idea of a common world, and in such a way that actually judgment, on the one hand, the one who judges, he presumes that there is already a common world. Why? Because if not for a common world, one's judgment wouldn't be possibly valid. To be valid for a judgment is to find agreement of others, and such an agreement can exist only due to common sensibility, and common sensibility can exist only due to a common world. So judgment is in this way related to a common world. The one who judges presupposes that there is already a common world, but at the same time, actually, the very process of judgment can produce the existence of such a common world. Why? Because the judgmental discussion kann streiten über Geschmack, ja, nicht disputieren, sondern streiten. This comes argumentation about polemics about tastes or judgmental discussion. It leads to finding adherent points in different persons' sensibility, so it can actually create a collective sensibility out of itself. But on the other hand, at the same time, the one who judges wants his or her judgment to be valid, and it means that the one who judges cares for a common world on the notion of which the judgment is based. So since I judge, I want my judgment to find agreement of others, and for such agreement to be possible, I want a common world to exist. So I care for that common world which I imagine when I judge. And such experience of caring for a common world is, I think, precisely what Arendt calls collective responsibility or political responsibility. Yes, as we remember, political responsibility is such a tricky thing. Yes, you can be or you are responsible for by certain deeds, not because you yourself committed them, but simply because you belong to certain polity, or in other words, to certain common world. In this sense, according to Arendt, for example, all French are responsible for deeds of Napoleon or Clemenceau, or all Russians are responsible for deeds of Stalin or Gorbachev, and so on. So, but in which way, in which sense responsible? Not in moral or legal sense, yes, because it's no moral or legal phenomenon, it's political phenomenon, collective responsibility. So when I am responsible for deeds of Gorbachev, this is not in the sense that I'm guilty for his crimes or misdeeds, not in the sense that I should feel ashamed about the collapse of Soviet Union or something like that. It's in the sense that I somehow relate myself to Gorbachev or to whoever through the concept of common world which we inhabit. And when I judge, For example, when I judge Stalin's deeds as crimes, I care to preserve the world in which these deeds can be counted for as crimes and not as heroic deeds, for example. And this is the way in which actually judgmental process leads to experience of collective responsibility. Do I still have time? 5 minutes, okay. Since I still have time, I want to say a few words about the problems which I see in this later Arendt's approach to judgment. Actually, I think that in her later writings, Arendt's philosophy turns out to be or to seem transcendental in an old-fashioned Kantian way, in the sense that for later Arendt, what is man? Man is actually a bunch of faculties. There is willing, there is thinking, there is judgment. God bless that we do have all these faculties. I'm not sure that I do have faculty of judgment or thinking. I'm afraid I am not, but okay, let's hope together with judgment, together with Arendt, I'm sorry, that we all do, because this is a necessary presupposition of her thinking in this later period. And actually, we all remember famous aphorism of Arendt that not man in singular, but man in plural inhabit the world. I think that this aphorism is irrelevant to Arendt's later writings, because for later Arendt, human plurality is not a matter of fact, but it's more of a project to be accomplished. It's a task, and actually, like this is the case for Kant as well, because for Kant, humanity and human world citizenship was something that doesn't exist yet, but which has to be accomplished. And this is also, I think, the case for later Arendt. But these stance make Arendt vulnerable for her own criticism toward Heidegger in her earlier essay Was ist Existenzphilosophie? Because in this essay, Arendt says, actually, I had a quotation from her, but unfortunately, well, my laptop is kaput, so I'm sorry. I'll just tell it by heart. So she says that according to Heidegger's analysis of Dasein, it turns out that all human beings exist actually separately from each other. They exist solely, not as a plurality, which means that, and for Arendt, this metaphysical analysis of Dasein led Heidegger later to his revocation of such notions as Volk or Grund, to evocation of this concepts to somehow, in a mythological way, fill this gap, this empty space between separate individuals. And this is precisely because, according to Heidegger's analysis of Dasein, human is not a social or political being in the first place. It's a being towards death, towards some individualizing event, which death is. And this is, I think, a big problem for Arendt later project as well, because actually she leaves us simply with her optimism about human condition, or rather about human nature, that there is judgment, there is thinking, there is willing, but are there? I'm not sure. So I think this is the end of my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll continue with Annika Glassmeier. Sie ist Absolventin der Fächer Politische Wissenschaften und Geschichte in Aachen, hat sie ihr Studium abgeschlossen und beschäftigt sich vor allem mit den Theorien des Antisemitismus, mit dem Zionismus, dem Nahostkonflikt und der Erinnerungskultur. Heute wird sie zum folgenden Thema sprechen. Wenigstens bin ich nicht unschuldig. Zum Verhältnis von Unschuld und Verantwortungslosigkeit im politischen Denken Hannah Arendts. Frau Glassmeier, bitte.
Ja, danke für die nette Begrüßung. Vorweg erstmal noch vielen Dank für die Einladung, dass Sie mir die Möglichkeit gegeben haben, heute teilzunehmen. Der Beitrag, den ich für heute vorbereitet habe, ist entstanden aus einem Teil meiner Masterarbeit, auf die ich jetzt gar nicht näher eingehen möchte, aber die Einleitung meines Titels ist entstanden aus einem Zitat Hannah Arendts, das die meisten von Ihnen wahrscheinlich aus dem Gauss-Interview kennen werden. Ich zitiere kurz. Funktioniert? Na. Na gut, so geht's auch. Also, ich bin schließlich nicht auf eine so friedliche Weise abgezogen und ich muss sagen, ich verspürte darüber eine gewisse Befriedigung. Ich wurde verhaftet, musste illegal das Land verlassen. Ich hatte sofort eine Befriedigung darüber. Ich dachte, wenigstens habe ich etwas gemacht, wenigstens bin ich nicht unschuldig, das soll mir keiner nachsagen. Nun, die Gelegenheit dazu gab mir damals die zionistische Organisation. Dieses Zitat hat mich damals in der Erarbeitungsphase meiner Masterarbeit irgendwie nicht mehr so richtig losgelassen, denn eigentlich ist es ja etwas eher Ungewöhnliches, dass Hannah Arendt von sich selber sagt, dass sie nicht unschuldig bleiben möchte. Zumindest hatte ich zunächst diesen Eindruck. Ich glaube aber, dass genau in dieser Aussage etwas ganz Grundlegendes zum Ausdruck kommt, dass Hannah Arendt vielleicht auch schon in ihrer frühen Lebensphase eher eine Art Handlungskompass in den außergewöhnlichen Umständen der totalen Herrschaft gewesen ist. Zu ihrem illegalen Engagement, das sie in dem Zitat anspricht, gehörten zum Beispiel auch kleinere Aufträge, die sie für die Zionisten im Auftrag von ihrem Freund Kurt Blumenfeld übernommen hat. Wieder im Gauss-Interview sagt sie dazu: Gut. Sie fragten mich, willst du es machen? Sage ich natürlich. Ich war sehr zufrieden. Erstens schien mir das sehr vernünftig und zweitens hatte ich das Gefühl, man kann doch irgendetwas tun. Man kann doch irgendetwas tun. Diese Haltung, Verantwortung zu übernehmen für die kleinen Sphären, in denen das weiterhin möglich war, entwickelte sich im Laufe der nächsten Jahre zu einer Art Kompass Arendts. Die praktischen Handlungsspielräume auszuloten und zu nutzen, gaben ihr Halt und Orientierung. Obwohl sie eigentlich Theoretikerin war, fand sie hier eine Art Zugang zur Welt der praktischen und aktiven Politik. Ein unumstößlicher Glaube an das Wunder, durch das eigene Handeln eben doch noch den Verlauf der Welt ein kleines Stückchen beeinflussen zu können, das zeichnet ihr doch einigermaßen oder überraschend optimistisches Menschenbild aus. Dies hat Hannah Arendt im Begriff der Natalität versucht zusammenzufassen, aber auch auf diesen werde ich jetzt im Folgenden aus Zeitgründen nicht näher eingehen. Hannah Arendt wollte also wenigstens nicht unschuldig bleiben. Ich habe mir einfach mal die Mühe gemacht, nachzugucken, was für Kategorien der Duden denn an Synonymen für diesen Begriff der Unschuld bereithält. Genau, ich habe das aufgeteilt in zwei verschiedene Kategorien. Auf der linken Seite sehen Sie eher positiv konnotierte Synonyme wie Anständigkeit, Makellosigkeit, Unbestolltenheit, gehoben Lauterkeit oder veraltet Rechtschaffenheit. Auf der anderen Seite stehen wiederum recht negativ konnotierte Begriffe, nämlich Ahnungslosigkeit, darunter sind auch Blauäugigkeit, Einfältigkeit, Gutgläubigkeit, Naivität, Einfalt oder Tumpheit. Wie gesagt, schon fast leicht spöttisch. Das ist auch eine Eigenschaft, die die meisten von uns ja aus Hannah Arendts manchmal sehr zynischen Kommentaren kennen. Die erste positiv konnotierte Kategorie kann man vielleicht ganz allgemein in Zusammenhang bringen mit dem Begriff des Gehorsams. Auf den werde ich allerdings später auch noch mal genauer eingehen. Die zweite Kategorie hingegen ist gekennzeichnet von Begriffen, die eher im Zusammenhang mit Unselbstständigkeit und schlechter Urteilskraft zu sehen sind. Damit entspricht die zweite Kategorie eher Arendts Einordnung des Sinngehalts für den Begriff Unschuld. Das Schuldigwerden als Gegenteil des Unschuldigseins ist nach Arendt dabei keineswegs etwas Verwerfliches, sondern zeugt gerade in Konfrontation mit dem Unrechtsstaat von einer reflektierten, selbstständigen und kritischen Haltung. Diese kam auch nicht nur rein gedanklich bei Arendt zum Ausdruck, sondern eben durch ihr Engagement auch praktisch. Das zeigt sich an den Beispielen, die ich eben gerade schon angerissen habe, nämlich, dass sie sich für die Zionisten organisiert hat, indem sie zum Beispiel Grollpropaganda gesammelt hat, um sie für Archivierungszwecke den Zionisten zur Verfügung zu stellen. Sie hat aber auch einige Zeit lang ihre Wohnung in der Berliner Opitzstraße zur Verfügung gestellt für Verfolgte des Regimes. Es ist jetzt immer wieder so, dass diese Geschichten, die wir von Hannah Arendt kennen, nicht zufällig zu uns gekommen sind, sondern dass wir viele dieser Geschichten kennen, weil Hannah Arendt sie uns ganz bewusst erzählt hat. Das steht auch im Zusammenhang mit dem Perlentauchen, das eben gerade schon angesprochen worden ist. Das sind immer wieder Geschichten, die sie anbringt zum Verdeutlichen ihrer eigenen Theorien. Gleichzeitig glaube ich auch, dass Hannah Arendts Bedürfnis, verstehen zu wollen, sicherlich auch mit dem Erfahrungsschatz zusammenhängt, den sie in ihrer sehr außergewöhnlichen Situation als deutsche Jüdin sammeln musste. Ich will damit nicht sagen, dass ihre komplette Theorie darauf fußt, dass sie diese extremen Erfahrungen gemacht hat. Das würde sicherlich auch zu kurz greifen. Aber es ist, glaube ich, nicht von der Hand zu weisen, dass die biografischen Erlebnisse gerade der jungen Hannah Arendt ihr späteres Denken ganz fundamental geprägt haben. Für Hannah Arendt besteht ein Zusammenhang zwischen der Zugehörigkeit der juristischen Person eines Individuums und der Vorbereitung seiner physischen Vernichtung in den Konzentrationslagern. Juden verloren im Nationalsozialismus jeglichen Status der personellen Legalität, obwohl sie zuvor nichts Kriminelles getan hatten. Dieses Paradox deutete Arendt im Gauss-Interview an, als sie beschreibt, wie die Vernehmung durch den deutschen Polizisten verlief, nachdem sie wegen ihres Engagements für die Zionisten verhaftet worden war. Dort sagt sie einigermaßen spöttisch, das war ein ganz reizender Kerl, der war ursprünglich von der Kriminalpolizei in die politische Abteilung avanciert. Der hatte keine Ahnung, was sollte er da? Er sagte mir immer, gewöhnlich habe ich da doch jemanden vor mir sitzen, da sehe ich nur nach, da weiß ich schon, was das ist. Aber was tue ich denn mit ihnen? Der Polizist hatte dabei offenbar zu Beginn der nationalsozialistischen Herrschaft noch nicht so recht verstanden, dass der Status der persönlichen Legalität einer Person unter dem nationalsozialistischen Regime nicht länger nur an den eigenen Taten bemessen wurde, sondern dass die Legalität einer Person fortan von der Zugehörigkeit zur deutschen Nation abhing. Diese wiederum war gebunden an die Zugehörigkeit oder den Ausschluss nach rassistischen Kriterien. Dies versetzte die Juden in Deutschland natürlich in die fatale Situation, dass der bloße Umstand, als Jude geboren worden zu sein, zum Verbrechen deklariert wurde. Ein Zustand, den sie durch ihre eigenen Handlungen nicht länger beeinflussen konnten, für den sie also auch in keinster Weise Verantwortung trugen. Sie waren nicht verantwortlich dafür, als Juden geboren zu sein. Schon früh formuliert Arendt auch ihre Beobachtung dieses Dilemmas aus, indem sie zum Beispiel sich mit dem Status der Flüchtlinge beschäftigt. In Elemente und Ursprünge der totalen Herrschaft schreibt sie zum Beispiel, der Flüchtling ist das, was ein Flüchtling seinem Wesen nach niemals sein darf. Er ist unschuldig, selbst im Sinne der ihn verfolgenden Mächte. Diese ihnen unabweisbar anhaftende Unschuld war ihr größtes Unglück. In ihr bekundete sich verhängnisvoller als in jeder anderen Qualität oder in allen Verlusten, dass die Rechtlosen nicht mehr in der Menschenwelt zu Hause waren, in der absolute Unschuld nicht geduldet wird, weil die absolute Verantwortungslosigkeit, die mit ihr Hand in Hand geht, unerträglich ist. Das Verhängnis, von dem Hannah Arendt in diesem Zusammenhang spricht, betrifft den Umstand, dass Flüchtlinge klassischerweise eigentlich Personen waren, die ihre Heimat verlassen mussten, weil sie zuvor mit dem mit dem Gesetz vor Ort in Konflikt geraten waren. Doch fortan änderte sich die Definition dieses Begriffs. Die Flüchtlinge des 20. Jahrhunderts mussten zu großen Zahlen ihre Heimat verlassen, obwohl sie nichts getan hatten. Der Grund, für den sie verfolgt wurden, bei den Juden, in dem Fall ihre jüdische Herkunft, lag außerhalb ihrer Verfügungsgewalt. Sie hatten, wie eben schon angedeutet, keine Verantwortung dafür. Genau dieser Umstand irritierte 1933 den Polizisten, der Hannah Arendt vernehmen sollte. Er war noch gewohnt an ein kausales Justizsystem, in dem bisher bei herkömmlichen Verbrechern immerhin, wie Arendt es formuliert, das, was sie getan hatten, in einem nachweisbaren Zusammenhang mit dem stand, was ihnen vorgeworfen wurde. Das, was die jüdischen Opfer getan oder eben nicht getan hatten, spielte unterdessen im Verfolgungswahn der Nationalsozialisten nicht länger die geringste Rolle. Die Opfer wurden für ihre Verfolger somit gewissermaßen eigenschaftslos. Verfolgt wurden sie so oder so. Ihre Taten erhielten erst wieder eine gewisse Relevanz, wenn diese Personengruppe tatsächlich etwas tat, was sie mit dem geltenden Gesetz in Konflikt brachte. Arendt schreibt dazu in Elemente und Ursprünge totaler Herrschaft: Es gehört zu den Aporien moderner Erfahrungen, dass es offenbar leichter ist, den völlig Unschuldigen seiner juristischen Person zu beglauben als irgendeinen anderen. Leichter als den politischen Gegner oder Verbrecher, bei denen sich selbst im Falle der infamsten Verfolgung oder der drakonischsten Gesetzgebung die juristische Person immer noch in dem Zusammenhang durchsetzt, der zwischen dem, was sie getan hat, und dem, was ihr geschieht, besteht. Ihr persönlicher Ungehorsam war für Arendt deshalb mehr als bloße Selbstbehauptung. Durch ihre eigenen illegalen Aktionen versuchte sie ein deutliches Signal in Richtung der Nationalsozialisten zu senden, dass sie sich eben nicht tatenlos mit der Rolle des wehrlosen Opfers zufrieden geben würde. Für Arendt sieht in der Zerstörung der juristischen Person dabei einen ersten Schritt einer graduellen Radikalisierung, die schließlich in der Vernichtung in den Konzentrationslagern münden sollte. Durch den Verlust des personellen Bezugs zu den ihnen vorgeworfenen Delikten wurden die Juden, aber auch andere Opfergruppen eben nicht nur entrechtet, sondern regelrecht entmenschlicht. Arendt beobachtet, dass auf diesem Weg die Opfer vor ihren Tätern all ihre Eigenschaften verloren und somit für die Verfolger nicht länger als Menschen galten. Der Verlust jeglichen Handlungsspielraums, den Arendt unter der Herrschaft des Totalitarismus beobachtet, offenbarte sich dabei in den Konzentrationslagern in seiner allerabscheulichsten Weise. Für Arendt steht deshalb fest, dass Unschuld in Konfrontation mit dieser Form der Entmenschlichung gar nicht erstrebenswert sein kann. Indem Arendt unterstellt, dass kein Mensch wirklich jemals völlig unschuldig ist, bekam die Existenz der jüdischen Opfer wieder einen gestalterischen Bezug zur Umwelt. So ist auch die folgende sehr bittere Aussage Arendts in einem privaten Brief an Karl Jaspers zu verstehen. So unschuldig, wie alle miteinander vor dem Gasofen waren, der widerwärtigste Wucherer, so unschuldig wie das neugeborene Kind, weil kein Verbrechen eine solche Strafe verdienen kann, so unschuldig sind die Menschen überhaupt nicht. Mit einer Schuld, die jenseits des Verbrechens steht, und einer Unschuld, die jenseits der Güte oder Tugend liegt, kann man menschlich-politisch überhaupt nichts anfangen. Damit meinte Arendt natürlich nicht, dass die jüdischen Opfer tatsächlich Verbrecher gewesen seien. Vielmehr spricht aus dieser Aussage ihre Sorge darum, was ein Status absoluter Unschuld eigentlich für einen Menschen und seine Rolle in der Welt bedeutet. Die Opfer der Nationalsozialisten wurden verfolgt, obwohl sie nichts getan hatten. Sie waren damit verabsolutierte Objekte der vollendeten Willkür ihrer Verfolger. So stellt Arendt fest, das Zitat, nur Verbrecher kann man bestrafen, Unerwünschte und Lebensuntaugliche lässt man von der Weltoberfläche verschwinden, als hätte es sie nie gegeben. Mit ihnen will man noch nicht einmal ein Exempel statuieren. Indem Arendt also unterstellt, dass Unschuld nicht erstrebenswert ist, bekam auch das Handeln der jüdischen Opfer, indem sie eben nicht unschuldig blieben, wieder einen bestimmten Bezug, einen gewissen gestalterischen Bezug zu ihrer Mitwelt. Indem sie zum Beispiel bewusst illegale Aufträge für die Zionisten übernahm und sie beim Einsatz gegen die Nationalsozialisten unterstützte, machte sie sich juristisch strafbar. Die Befriedigung, von der sie in diesem Zusammenhang spricht, ergab sich gerade daraus, dass diese Handlungen damit wieder für ihre Verfolger eine neue Relevanz bekamen, die sie eigentlich sonst nicht gehabt hätten. Noch ein Zitat. Der gleiche Mann, der gestern noch im Gefängnis saß, nur weil er überhaupt auf der Welt war, der vollkommen rechtlos war, dauernd vor der Deportation zitterte oder vor dem Internierungslager, ist plötzlich im Genuss aller bürgerlichen Rechte, nur weil er sich endlich wirklich etwas hat zu Schulden kommen lassen. Unschuldig zu bleiben, war somit nach Arendt keine adäquate Reaktion auf das Unrechtsregime. Der Versuch, sich in die Gesellschaft zu assimilieren, sich anzupassen, ein Parvenu zu werden, musste also von vornherein scheitern. Schlimmer noch, der Versuch einer widerspruchslosen Anpassung oder eines unauffälligen Aufgehens in den neuen Verhältnissen musste von vornherein vergeblich sein, da in den Augen der Nazis bereits die bloße Existenz der Juden ein Verbrechen darstellte. Deshalb ist es Arendt ein Bedürfnis, wenigstens nicht unschuldig zu bleiben. Gehorsam in Hoffnung auf Gnade kam also nicht in Frage. Hiermit möchte ich abschließend noch ganz knapp einen weiteren Punkt anreißen, in dem dieser Zusammenhang steht. Ich möchte an dieser Stelle noch einmal an die erste Kategorie an Synonymen erinnern. An die erste Kategorie an Synonymen erinnern, zu denen auch Untadeligkeit und Rechtschaffenheit gehören. Die Unschuld hat in diesem Zusammenhang mit Gehorsam vor dem Recht zu tun. Im Nationalsozialismus wurde nun jedoch das Unrecht zum Gesetz erhoben. Arendt lehnt deshalb Gehorsam vor dieser Art der Autorität, wir haben den Begriff eben gerade erläutert, was ich jetzt meine, ist die Autorität des Unrechtsregimes, das lehnt sie natürlich ab. Dies wird besonders deutlich durch die Aussagen in der Eichmann-Kontroverse, wenn es um Eichmanns Banalität geht. Dabei wirft sie ihm Kadavergehorsam gegenüber der nationalsozialistischen Autorität vor. Im Interview mit Joachim Fest sagt Arendt, Gehorsam sei für kleine Kinder. Sie geht davon aus, dass jeder denkende Mensch durch seine Urteilskraft selbstständig in der Lage sein muss, die Folgen seines Handelns abzusehen und somit bereit sein muss, die individuelle Verantwortung für seine Taten zu tragen. Eichmann, der sich bei dem Verhör mehrfach darauf berief, er habe nur im Kantschen Sinne seine Pflicht erfüllt, hält sie entgegen, dass nach Kant kein Mensch das Recht habe zu gehorchen. Sie sagt, Kants ganze Moral läuft doch darauf hinaus, dass jeder Mensch bei jeder Handlung sich selbst überlegen muss, ob die Maxime seines Handelns zum allgemeinen Gesetz werden kann. Das heißt, es ist ja gerade sozusagen das extrem Umgekehrte des Gehorsams. Jeder ist Gesetzgeber. Im Kantschen Sinne fordert Arendt also von jedem erwachsenen Menschen, der im vollen Besitz seiner Sinne ist, Verantwortung für die eigenen Taten zu übernehmen und die Konsequenzen seines Handelns abzusehen und zu tragen. Unschuld ist somit keine Tugend. In einem funktionierenden Rechtssystem kann sich ein aufgeklärter Mensch problemlos dem Gesetz unterordnen. Zu gehorchen bedeutet aber, die Verantwortung an eine andere Autorität abzugeben. Die Fähigkeit, über das eigene Handeln selbstständig nachzudenken, bedeutet dabei für Arendt, den Gehorsam zu verweigern, wenn die Konsequenzen nicht länger mit dem eigenen Gewissen in Einklang gebracht werden können. In diesem Fall verbietet es das Gewissen, unschuldig zu bleiben und einfach nur zu funktionieren. So, ich glaube, ich bin zwar unter der Zeit, aber ich danke Ihnen bei der Hitze jetzt trotzdem für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Vielen Dank, Frau Glassmeier. We'll continue now with our colleague from the İzmir Ekonomi Üniversitesi, Devrim Sezer. He is mainly interested in history of political thought, and he has co-translated the book of Hannah Arendt, Thoughts on Revolution and Politics, and currently he's working on the translation into Turkish of Hannah Arendt's lectures on Kant's political philosophy. So today we'll hear a contribution under the title Coming to Terms with the Past, Arendt and Jaspers on Guilt and Responsibility. Your floor.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Because of the time constraints, I will stick to the text. Both the centenary of the Armenian genocide and the 17th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 2015 reminded us once again of the significance of coming to terms with the past. But what exactly is the meaning of coming to terms with the past? Should the concept of guilt be applied to nations or collectivities? Can the citizens of a nation be held responsible or guilty? Which one? How should present-day generations think about their responsibility in relation to past wrongs? If present-day generations respond to past wrongs with denial or indifference, would they be implicated in past injustices as well? These are the motivational questions for my paper, and I will explore these questions with a partial critique of Jaspers' The Question of German Guilt, which was published in 1946, Die Schuldfrage, in dialogue with Hannah Arendt's interpretation of guilt and responsibility. I'd like to argue that their approaches on guilt and responsibility not only have had a formative influence on philosophical disputes about the Holocaust, but they also resonate with Turkey's failure to come to terms with the Armenian genocide. The primary purpose of my analysis is to question the idea that the prosecution or condemnation of state criminals such as Adolf Eichmann in the case of the Holocaust, or a few young Turks in the case of the Armenian genocide is sufficient to settle accounts once and for all and to move on. Empirical evidence, both from the 1950s of Germany and contemporary Turkey, suggests that there is usually a clear official and popular tendency to attribute all past wrongs to a few bad apples. But in the case of a genocide, with a wide gray area of collaboration, unquestioning obedience, even passive support, the conviction of only the direct perpetrators creates a very narrow focus for understanding the meaning of responsibility. Such an exclusive focus on the perpetrators of state crimes is problematic for two reasons. First, it tends to free both the bystanders of the past and present-day generations from any burden of responsibility. And second, such an approach diverts attention from the responsibility owed by the perpetrating community to the victims and their descendants. With these problems in mind, I will explore their accounts, Jaspers' and Arendt's accounts of guilt and responsibility, with particular reference to these four groups: perpetrators of the past, bystanders of the past, present-day generations, and finally, victims and their descendants. And first, I will begin with Jaspers. The Schuldfrage is considered by many scholars to be one of the founding texts of the question of coming to terms with the past in post-war Germany. For Jaspers, all citizens are collectively responsible for past wrongs, but they are not collectively guilty in the moral and legal sense of the term. He claims that in order to see why this is so, we have to differentiate between four types of guilt: criminal guilt, political guilt, moral guilt, and finally, metaphysical guilt. Criminal guilt is the result of breaking recognized positive laws. It is always the outcome of an act committed by an individual. The concept of criminal guilt loses its meaning, Jaspers argues, if we extend it to the members of an entire nation. For state crimes, and this is a quote from the Schuldfrage, perpetrators, Hitler and his accomplices, that small minority of tens of thousands, unquote, are charged and tried. This was indeed, Jaspers insists, the motivation behind the Nuremberg trials. However, he also argues that the restriction of the Nuremberg trials to perpetrators of state crimes alone does not free the German people of all guilt. Jaspers here has a clear agenda. First, the separation of criminal guilt from other types of guilt, and second, reminding German society of the fact that no one is guiltless. Indeed, unlike criminal guilt, all other forms of guilt address not the criminal deeds of the perpetrators, but the complicity of the bystanders. Second form of guilt, political guilt, which Jaspers also refers to as political responsibility, is primarily due to being implicated as citizens in the crimes of a murderous state. Such responsibility includes all citizens without exception, extending to those who did not directly participate in state atrocities, and even to those who were in principle critical of the regime and its policies. Thus, in contrast with criminal guilt, political responsibility needs to be collectively assumed. Since Jaspers argues that all citizens are co-responsible for the acts committed by their state. Moral guilt, the next form of guilt, might be incurred through an unconditional submission and comfortable adaptation to a morally illegitimate regime and indifference to injustice and suffering of others. It applies to those who close their eyes to the Holocaust, or let themselves seduced with personal advantages, or obeyed from fear, or just followed the orders from above. Metaphysical guilt, the last one in Jaspers' list, originates in every person's responsibility. And this is a quote from the text, for every wrong and every injustice in the world, unquote. And hence refers to a lack of absolute solidarity with humanity as such. Such guilt arises when nothing is done to prevent the harms or to show that one disapproves of them. The implications of Jaspers' analysis can be summed up as follows. Only a small minority are criminally guilty for the crimes of the Nazi regime, but all Germans are politically and collectively responsible. Many, if not all, are morally guilty because of their individual actions. The emphasis here is on individual, not collective, and action. And all, again, are metaphysically guilty because of their individual inactions. Second, criminal guilt requires trial and punishment. Political responsibility requires reparations. Moral guilt requires penance and moral renewal. And metaphysical guilt requires radical transformation. Here, Jaspers puts the emphasis on moral guilt and moral renewal because, in his view, the deeper process of coming to terms with the past depends on what he calls purification of the tainted German national identity. My first criticism of Jaspers. This emphasis on moral guilt and moral renewal turns the debate on guilt and responsibility into a dispute about being German, German national identity, and its purification. Third, political responsibility, again, there are some ambivalences in Jaspers' approach. What should be the outcome of assuming political responsibility for past wrongs? Thus, political responsibility extends beyond the present-day generation. Jaspers' response to these questions are somewhat ambivalent. He explicitly argues that political responsibility requires reparations, but it is not clear whether these are meant to be material or symbolic or both. And finally, because of his exclusive concern with the purification of German national identity, his analysis remains largely silent about the victims. Notwithstanding his continual remarks about political responsibility, the Schuldfrage remains virtually silent as to what form such responsibility might take towards the victims and their descendants. And I'm not the only one who is critical of Jaspers' approach. Arendt also offers her criticisms in an indirect way. Unlike Jaspers, who argues that there are 4 types of guilt, Arendt carefully distinguishes between guilt and responsibility, claiming that guilt is always personal and is linked to an individual who commits a crime. If there is no crime, there is no guilt, as my colleague emphasized in his presentation. Nevertheless, there is, again, this is a quote from Arendt's text collective responsibility. Nevertheless, there is such a thing as responsibility for things one has not done. One can be held liable for them. For Arendt, Jaspers' emphasis on moral and metaphysical guilt is problematic for two reasons. Here are the reasons. First, it may divert attention from political responsibility towards the public world to considerations of personal integrity and subjective guilt feelings. And second, it may also lead to a cheap sentimentality. Sometimes this, we see this among the activists, contemporary activists. And this attitude, Arendt argues, obscures the role of the real culprits, as she often puts it, where all are guilty, no one is. I will analyze Arendt's reflections on guilt and responsibility with reference to four groups I have identified in my introduction: perpetrators, bystanders, present-day generations, and victims. First, perpetrators. Perpetrators of administered massacres like Eichmann are guilty of crimes against humanity. It is not possible, Arendt argues. Oh. Okay. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Perpetrators of administered massacres like Eichmann are guilty of crimes against humanity. Arendt claims that it is not possible to say that Eichmann or bureaucrats like him cannot be held responsible for such crimes simply because they are just cogs following the superior orders in a murderous state machinery. Eichmann willingly accepted his role and directly participated in the deportation of Jews to death camps. He is guilty precisely on account of what he actually did, and all the other perpetrators of crimes as well. What about the bystanders? Jaspers, as we have seen, clearly attributes guilt of some sort to all German citizens. Not only does Arendt disagree with this attribution of guilt to all the bystanders of the Holocaust, but she also implicitly identifies two ways in which the bystanders responded to the crimes of the Nazi regime: obedience and withdrawal. This means that within the bystanders, there are two subgroups: those who obeyed, unquestioningly, and those who withdrew from public life altogether. The first group involves the obedient majority, all of whom share responsibility without any visible proof of guilt. They were sympathetic to the Nazi regime, aided its rise to power, gave their support to it until the very end, and believed in Hitler. Nevertheless, unlike Eichmann, they did not directly take part in administered mass murder, but like Eichmann, and this is Arendt's most important point, they were thoughtless, by which Arendt means that they were unable to judge, to tell right from wrong. Precisely because of this thoughtlessness, they unquestioningly obeyed and supported the policies of the Nazi regime and remained indifferent to the fate of the victims. They are not guilty, though. Rather, they are morally responsible for the crimes. The second group involves those few, minority, who were still able to tell right from wrong, did not in any way collaborate with the Nazi party, refused to participate in public life, and even tried to aid those in danger. These non-participants were the only ones who dared to judge by themselves. They alone were able to avoid becoming implicated in crimes. This withdrawal from public life, Arendt argues, under despotism, was praiseworthy from a moral point of view. True, they were not resistors, this is a quote, but they never suffered a crisis of conscience. They were neither saints nor heroes, and they remained completely silent, unquote. Since they withdrew from public life, their actions were moral rather than political, but they were not morally implicated in the crimes of the past. What about present-day generations? Arendt says only that every generation, by virtue of being born into a historical continuum, can be held liable for the deeds and misdeeds of the past. Such political responsibility for things we have not done is the unavoidable result of being a member of a nation, of a political community. What about the victims? Regarding the victims, she says almost nothing in her writings on guilt and responsibility, if we set aside her astute observations in the origins of totalitarianism for the time being. But in one of her letters to Karl Jaspers, in the immediate aftermath of the publication of Die Schuldfrage, we encounter intimations of a more satisfactory account merely hinted at by Arendt in passing, explicitly criticizing the German-centered approach of Jaspers. Arendt argues that assuming responsibility for past wrongs should involve, the first point, this is a quote from the text, a positive political statement addressed to the victims. Apparently, she sees a gap, a kind of hole in Jaspers' account of guilt and responsibility. In addition to a more detailed, this is my second point, Arendt's second point, in her letter to Jaspers, in addition to a more detailed account of material reparations, which she thinks is non-existent in Jaspers' book, there should also be what I'd like to call symbolic reparations. These are not Arendt's own words, these are my words. Since this is the heart of my interpretation, I will quote the text in full. This is a letter from the letter. One should say to displaced persons, for example, you should know that you have every right of citizenship here in Germany, that you can count on our total support, mindful of what Germans have inflicted on Jewish people. We will, in a future German republic, constitutionally renounce anti-Semitism, stipulating, for example, that any Jew, regardless of where he is born, can become a citizen of this republic, enjoying all rights of citizenship without ceasing to be a Jew. Arendt's reflections in this letter, I'd like to argue, not only provide a useful corrective to Jaspers' book, but they may also sharpen our understanding of Turkey's failure to come to terms with the Armenian genocide. By way of conclusion, I'd like to emphasize 3 lessons that we can draw from Arendt's suggestions to Jaspers, with particular reference to the Armenian genocide, of course. First, present-day generations who were not directly implicated in past wrongs have a continuing political responsibility to make an effort to break with the past. The repeated denial to acknowledge past wrongs means maintaining solidarity with the perpetrators, the first group in my list, which creates a fresh wrong, a fresh wound that compounds the original one, because it appears as a continuing act of injustice towards the victims and their descendants. In my view, denialism belongs to the same history of injustice and disrespect, and this is how it is experienced and understood by the descendants of the victims. Second, the political responsibility of present-day generations does not end with an explicit acknowledgement of past wrongs, especially when there are enduring material effects of past injustices. Assuming responsibility should also involve making reparations, redressing past wrongs as far as possible. The issue here is not whether individual citizens in Turkey today, their ancestors, personally benefited from past wrongs. This is not the point, but rather that they now benefit from an unjustly acquired national inheritance. This is not a matter of collective guilt, but of collective responsibility. Reparations material reparations, are a response to this collective liability. But this is not enough. Assuming responsibility, this is my final point, should also involve an official declaration of symbolic reparations. Following Arendt's lead, we should be able to say in Turkey today, mindful of what Turks have inflicted on Armenian people, we will now declare that any Armenian, regardless of where she is born, can become a citizen of the Turkish Republic, enjoying all rights of citizenship without ceasing to be an Armenian. That Turkey has not even come close to such a proper understanding of coming to terms with the past is beyond dispute. But Arendt's reflections on this problem can sharpen our understanding of Turkey's failure and can perhaps even stimulate further academic and public debate about the long shadow of the Armenian genocide. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much for this interesting contribution. Dear colleagues, we have now approximately maximum 30 minutes for the discussion. Please, for your question. Politischen.
Actually, I have a few questions, but maybe I'll ask just one thing about the last presentation. First of all, thank you. It was brilliant and very interesting. Thank you. One thing that I would like to suggest more than asking is that you use the concept of forgiveness from Derrida in in what you do, because in the way that Derrida is presenting the paradox of forgiveness might be very, very relevant to the way you present the things. Because if you, just as an example, Derrida says about the German regime that right after the Holocaust, paradoxically, they had to do two opposite things: to say that they are completely not Nazis, that to have a distance between them and Nazism, and at the same time ask for forgiveness for what Germany did. And that's, if you are completely not Nazi, then you don't need to have to ask any forgiveness. And Derrida said this is exactly the point about forgiveness and about guilt. He says about forgiveness, but I think it actually is also about guilt. If it's only if you actually deeply understand that you are guilty, then you could ask for being judged and being forgiven. So this is something that I just like to add to, that you can use in your presentation, and thank you for, especially for the last thing that you said about the Armenian and Turkish people.
Would you like to react?
I'm familiar with Derrida's account of forgiveness, but I think at this stage, any reference to the idea of forgiveness doesn't make any sense in the context of Turkey, because at this stage we haven't seen so far any explicit acknowledgement of past wrongs. Under such circumstances, all the talk about forgiveness doesn't make any sense. For the present, though, I mean, perhaps in the future, but for the present, it doesn't make any sense to ask for forgiveness. For example, from the Armenian people. There should be first an explicit acknowledgement of past wrongs, coming from, officially from the Turkish state, but also from, informally, from Turkish civil society. In the absence of such an explicit acknowledgement, all the talk about forgiveness, in my view, doesn't make any sense. But thanks for your comment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, this is a question to Mr. Aronson. I'm sure you're familiar with Arendt's admission or contention that Kantian judgment is pretty much like phronesis.
Pretty much what, I'm sorry?
Like phronesis, like the Greek phronesis, Aristotle's phronesis. Mm-hmm. Phronesis?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So she explicitly said that Kantian judgment is another expression of the insight behind the concept of phronesis. So my question would be, why does she need Kantian judgment? I mean, what is there in Kantian judgment that phronesis does not contain? And just to explain a little bit the question, I think if you look at phronesis and the way Arendt explains it, it's not Aristotelian. She treats it as the Greek understanding of practical reason or the insights of the statesman, and the way she interprets it, exactly she interprets Kantian judgment. So this, just to give this nuance to my question. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start from the end. You said that for her it's not just Aristotle's concept phronesis, but it's a Greek way of understanding judgment. I think that sometimes, I'm not sure I'm right because I'm not an expert in Hellenism, but I think that sometimes, and probably very often, Arendt just borrows some Aristotle's concept and pretends that that was actually Greek way of understanding anything. But you could always object that probably that was just Aristotle's concept. And okay, well, I don't know actually. And for the first, why did she need Kantian judgment? I think that's precisely because Kantian judgment presupposes outsideness of the judge, unlike Aristotle's or Greek phronesis, because Greek phronesis is a virtue of the statesman, yes, of the one who acts, and Kant's judgment is some special faculty which you can only exert when you do not participate in the events about which you judge. And I think that it was important for Arendt also because of historical circumstances, because when she developed her theory of judgment, the events which she wanted her audience to judge, the events of the Second World War and of Holocaust primarily, they were already the past. And so the task of her audience, as she saw it, was disinterested judgment and not some sort of exerting a political virtue. This is how I think it is.
Thanks.
I have a question for Devrim. I am representing here the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM, where just day before yesterday we had a discussion about academic freedom in the other Europe. And we discussed Russia, Hungary, and Turkey. And Turkish case presented by a wonderful Turkish-Austrian scholar Ayşe Kalgar, anthropologist from Vienna University, proved to be the most disturbing one. She, of course, mentioned about thousands of people who are expelled from the university, and she even went as far as to use the notion of social death that many people are now subjected to. So my question is, in connection to this, is how do you imagine the audience for the wonderful analysis that you presented to us?
This is an excellent question. To be quite honest with you, I made similar presentations on a number of occasions in different cities in Izmir. In Turkey, in Izmir, in Ankara, in Istanbul. I presented on the Armenian genocide, on Arendts, Jaspers, and there is a lively discussion going on in Turkey among critical academics, first of all, but also among critical civil society activists. There is such political dynamism, such lively debates on the Armenian genocide. But at the same time, as he pointed out, there is that kind of state pressure on critical academics, no doubt about this, and we feel this pressure. But I think this is the nature of the thing. I mean, it's quite easy to make such a presentation in Vienna, but it is not always the case to do the same thing in Turkey. You feel the pressure, no doubt about this.
I have a question for everyone, I guess, because I was always wondering about the connection between responsibility and action, whether responsibility for what your grandfathers or great-grandfathers did is primary to your action. Thus, if responsibility is one of the principles of action, actually for Germany, for example, saying, okay, we have to think in our actions that the Shoah is part of our history and we're responsible for not letting it happen again. So, because I was always wondering about this responsibility thing, what do you think about it? Each and everyone who's thought about it, is it something which is prior to action or after action? Is my action the base of responsibility for the next generation?
Well, you know, I think it takes Fichte to answer, because actually that's an old question in German idealism. What is first, action or thinking or conception? But actually, I think that on the one hand, of course, what is your action based on if you don't have any preconception, if you don't have any notion of responsibility before you act, on the one hand. But on the other hand, well, you know, what's your action based on? Well, that's, I'm sorry for being so speculative, but I think that actually probably there's a paradox that any sense of responsibility presupposes some irresponsible action being made, because if there was no such action, then responsibility for what, actually? I don't know. It's a difficult question. I think it's a very philosophical question as well, but probably someone can answer more substantially.
Yeah, maybe the difficulty in that question might be that it also concerns at what stage somebody is acting and feeling responsible. Because, for example, with my presentation, I wanted to show that Hannah Arendt specifically tried to commit actions to not be unguilty, but in a way of not, of participating in an action against the regime that was unjust. And she is explaining situations that are very much in the beginning of the regime of National Socialism. And then I think what becomes more and more important over time was that, if people figured out their possibilities of taking still actions, or at least refused to take actions, because there are actions that put you on the morally wrong side, and there are actions that put you on the morally right side. And sometimes the easier way is just to do nothing. This would be like getting back to the inner dialogue with yourself and at least figuring out what is right and wrong. And then for your presentation, I think one of the problems of the current generation, also in Turkey, but also in Germany, is when you feel responsible for deeds that your grandparents did, or in the case of Turkey, even the great-grandparents, the problem, of course, will occur at what level it's possible to find it's oneself responsible or guilty, because responsibility is also not the same as guilt. That is also something that one needs to keep in mind, that I'm not guilty for the deeds my grandparents did, but I can feel responsible for not repeating them, or like aiming at a world in which these kind of actions don't have any place.
I'd like to say a couple of words about this. In my view, what makes Arendts such a fascinating political philosopher is that her account of collective responsibility has both backwards and forward-looking aspects. When you act, you feel the burden, the weight of the past on your shoulders. But Arendt also makes it quite explicit that this shouldn't paralyze you, because you also have responsibility for the future. So there is this, balanced approach, really, in Arendt, both backward-looking and forward-looking aspects.
Thanks.